In April 1945, a massive formation of Allied B-29 bombers roared over the Celebes Islands, their bays heavy with fire and steel. Their target was a Japanese military complex, a cluster of barracks and industrial sheds that looked exactly like a high-value ammunition depot. To the pilots thousands of feet above, it was just another coordinate on a map. They had no idea that inside those buildings were nearly 3,000 starving Allied prisoners of war. But as the lead bomber began its final run, the pilot saw something impossible on the ground. A massive, perfectly geometric shape was forming in the center of the camp. It was a giant, white, human U.S. sign, stretching across the dusty courtyard. One man, Commander Richard Antrim, was standing at the center of that human signboard, gambling the lives of 2,700 men on a single trick. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become the most incredible rescue in the history of naval aviation. Commander Richard Antrim had already seen more combat than most. As the executive officer of the USS Pope, he had fought through the Battle of the Java Sea until his ship was blasted into the depths by Japanese cruisers in 1942. Antrim and his crew were plucked from the water, but their survival was the beginning of a different kind of hell. They were transported to the Makassar POW camp on the island of Celebes. Life in the camp was defined by malaria, starvation rations, and the arbitrary brutality of the guards. By 1945, the prisoners were skeletal, many too weak to stand. Antrim, however, took his role as the senior American officer seriously. He became a buffer between the guards and his men, often taking beatings intended for others. The situation became truly desperate in late April. The Allied offensive was closing in, and the Japanese were becoming increasingly paranoid. They had moved the prisoners into a series of sheds that were situated directly adjacent to a legitimate tactical target, a Japanese naval base. To an aerial observer using the technology of 1945, the entire area appeared to be one large military target. Bombs had already begun falling near the perimeter. The prisoners knew it was only a matter of time before a stray wing or a miscalculated drop annihilated the entire camp. They were trapped between their oppressors on the ground and their liberators in the sky. There was no way to communicate with the aircraft, and the Japanese refused to move the camp. As the roar of B-24 and B-29 engines became a daily occurrence, Richard Antrim realized that a standard signal, a cloth flag or a smoke fire, would be too small to be seen from 30,000 feet. He needed something high contrast, massive and unmistakable. He gathered his men in the courtyard, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Most expected another lecture on maintaining discipline. Instead, Antrim gave them a job that sounded like an impossible mission. He wanted to use the prisoners themselves to build a giant signboard. The stupid idea was this: thousands of men would lay flat on the ground in a specific formation. By using the contrast between their white undergarments and the dark earth of the courtyard, they could create a message that could be read by a pilot traveling at 300 miles per hour. But there was a catch. The Japanese guards were on high alert. Any gathering of more than a dozen prisoners was usually met with machine gun fire. Antrim was asking over 2,000 men to walk out into the open, in plain view of both the Japanese towers and the Allied bombers, and lie down. If the Japanese thought it was a riot, they would open fire. If the Allied pilots thought it was a military formation, they would drop their entire payload directly on top of identifying marks. It was a 50-50 gamble with the highest possible stakes. Antrim personally approached the Japanese camp commander. He used a trick of psychology, convincing the commander that if the Americans bombed the camp, the guards would die too. He bluffed that he could negotiate with the planes if the commander allowed the men to assemble. The Japanese commander, terrified of the increasing air raids, surprisingly agreed, but he gave Antrim only 10 minutes to form the sign before his guards would begin firing into the crowd. The preparation was silent and mechanical. Antrim had already mapped out the coordinates of the U and the S using paces across the dirt. He assigned leaders to each part of the letters. Every man who could still walk was involved. Those who couldn't walk were carried by their friends to fill in the gaps. The prisoners stripped off their outer tunics, revealing their white undershirts. In the tropical sun, the white fabric shone against the dark, packed volcanic soil of the courtyard. They moved like a human tide. No shouting, no panicking. Just 2,700 men dragging their broken bodies into two distinct, massive characters. As they got into position, the sound of engines intensified. The B-29s were on their approach. The Japanese guards in the towers leveled their light machine guns, their fingers hovering over the triggers. They didn't understand what the U.S. stood for, but they understood that if this went wrong, their career and their life would end in a fireball. Antrim stood at the intersection of the letters, his arms folded. He was the conductor of this human lighthouse. He watched the sky, counting the seconds. He could see the bomb bay doors opening on the lead B-29. This was the moment of truth. If the pilots misinterpreted the sign as a ground-to-air defense tactic, or simply missed it, the next sound would be the whistling of 1,000-pound ordnance. The lead B-29, piloted by a young captain, had the Macassar naval target centered in his Norden bomb site. The crosshairs moved over the barracks. His finger was on the release trigger. But as the plane banked slightly for its final correction, a glint caught his eye. In the center of the dark brown square of the POW camp, two bright white letters shimmered. U.S. The pilot blinked. It was impossible. He was hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. He called out over the radio to the rest of the formation. Target check! Target check! Hold the release! The bombers roared directly over the courtyard at low altitude. Down on the ground, the prisoners didn't move. They lay perfectly flat, 2,700 white specks forming an undeniable message of identity. They could feel the vibration of the engines in their bones. They could smell the exhaust. Many expected the sky to fall, but the sky remained whole. The lead B-29 pulled its nose up, and the following planes veered off their target path. The bombs remained in their racks. From the windows of the bombers, the crews could see thousands of men looking up. They realized instantly that this wasn't an ammunition dump. It was a prison camp filled with their own brothers. The Japanese guards remained frozen in their towers. They had seen the bombers line up perfectly, and they had seen them pull away at the last possible moment. Commander Antrim's trick had worked. He had transformed a faceless group of victims into a strategic beacon. For the rest of the day, the bombers circled at a distance. They no longer dropped explosives. Instead, they began dropping supplies, crates of chocolate, medicine, and cigarettes. The human signboard had not only saved the camp from destruction, but had established a lifeline that would keep the prisoners alive until the formal surrender of Japan just months later. Antrim stood alone in the center of the courtyard as the men slowly stood up, their skeletal frames silhouetted against the departing formation. They had cheated fate by coming together to write their names in the dirt. The results of Richard Antrim's unconventional tactic were definitive and life-saving. In a single 60-second window, he had saved the lives of 2,700 Allied prisoners. This number included sailors, airmen, and soldiers from across the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. But the trick had an even wider impact. The Japanese guards and the camp commander, fearing immediate retaliation by the Allied forces once the island was liberated, began treating the prisoners with newfound respect. The balance of power in the camp had shifted. Antrim had proven that he could speak to the sky, and that the sky would listen. When the war ended in August 1945 and the liberation teams arrived at Macassar, they found the highest survival rate of any Japanese POW camp in that region. The human signboard was documented by intelligence officers who were bewildered that a naval officer had thought to use his men as literal ink on a page. For his actions at Macassar, not just the signboard incident, but his years of enduring beatings to protect his men, Richard Antrim was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was one of only a handful of officers to receive the award for actions performed while in captivity. The numbers told the final story. 2,700 lives saved, 1,000 pounds of bombs diverted, 1 human sign, and 0 Allied casualties in the raid. Richard Antrim had taken the absolute worst-case scenario and neutralized it with nothing but the white shirts of his squad and a brilliant bit of mathematical choreography. Commander Richard Antrim retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1954, but his story faded into the deeper reaches of military history. Unlike Audie Murphy or Desmond Doss, he didn't have a Hollywood film made about his life. Yet for the families of those 2,700 men, he was the greatest hero of the war. His legacy is one of creative leadership under extreme duress. Antrim showed that when regular methods of defense are stripped away, when you have no weapons, no armor, and no communication, the only thing you have left is your people. By organizing those men into a cohesive symbol, he gave them something more important than a signal. He gave them a sense of purpose. Today, the story of the Macassar signboard is taught as a masterclass in situational awareness. It serves as a reminder that the underdog's most powerful weapon isn't necessarily the one that kills, but the one that communicates. Richard Antrim passed away in 1969, but the echo of his trick still rings through history. Every time a pilot sees a signal from the ground, they are looking for the same thing those B-29 pilots saw in April 1945. The undeniable proof that even in the darkest pits of human suffering, there is still someone down there fighting to bring the boys home.